So today we have actually come here for an event, digital kleptocracy and democratic accountability. So, and here we have as a panelist Devdatta, who is from Internet Freedom Foundation. So, Internet Freedom Foundation is a group of activists and technical workers who are actually working towards handling the legal issues, which are legal issues around issues such as data privacy, surveillance, and other digital related features, particularly when it comes to government policies. And also we have with us Professor Ritika Kera, who's an associate professor and who works in developmental economics from IIT Delhi. And we have with us Srinivas Kodali, who is an independent researcher who particularly looks at data and other digitalizations and its involvements in society and economy. So let's start our event. So we'll start our event. Let me start by introducing group. So I'm Kaushik. We are organizing this event on behalf of Ambedkar Peer Study Circle. So we have been here in our campus for last 6 years. So we have conducted many events in our campus, particularly invited lectures, panel discussions, and group discussions on social issues, social relevant issues, and particularly we look at issues which affect people at large, and also look at issues such as higher education and issues like social justice and affirmative policies. And here we have today, we are actually in the COVID-19 lockdown time, where the government is actually pushing policies across many sectors, many fields, without much of a critical debate on it. And one of these policies is actually bringing in an app called Arogya Setu app, which has actually been pushed without a consent or a discussion or debate with the concerned stakeholders. And even as many of us have heard, in the initial time, it was made compulsory for both government and private employees. And later, when organizations and activists from people, including Internet Freedom Foundation, when they have raised these concerns, the government have budgeted policy and made this installation optional, or at least it claimed that it should be optional. And there are still very serious concerns about the usage of this app, the privacy, the data, and how this data will be used or misused by different parties and all that. And and not just that, the digitization policy, pushing digitization in different domains, has been happening in the recent few years in many areas, like particularly Aadhaar, and now the Arogya Setu. And now there is this new database being created using Aadhaar. It's called as the National Health Stack. So there are these different digitalization policies are being brought in, but there's not much debate on the ramifications of it. So today we have invited these three esteemed panelists to have a wider discussion, particularly among the student community here. So with that, I'll go ahead with the event. Before that, I just switch on the Facebook Live. Just we'll wait for a minute. I just switch on the Facebook Live so that you can. So we are planning to actually go to publish this event in Facebook, stream it live, so that people who are not able to join here or so otherwise can actually also look in our page and.
When the government revealed that private industry volunteers were involved in the development of the Arogya Setu app. For those of you who may not know, Arogya Setu is a COVID surveillance app which has been launched by the Indian government in early April. When the app was launched, it was initially projected to be a proximity exposure notification app, but its present scope has gone much beyond that. Most recently, Arogya Setu has also now become a service which refers users to certain telemedicine and e-pharmacy services on another portal called Arogya Setu Mitra. And this is obviously concerning. And this is happening at a time when telemedicine is becoming increasingly popular and important because hospitals are overwhelmed and hospitals have become hotspots of COVID. So anybody who needs to access medical care, which isn't emergent and maybe doesn't require hospitalization, has no other recourse except to rely on telemedicine services. A lot of commentators have pointed out that telemedicine services are currently going through what digital payments went through during demonetization. And there's going to be huge payoffs for early movers and companies who get into this market and are able to capture a very large user base of patients who are using telemedicine and e-pharmacies perhaps for the first time. So you can imagine why in this context, being featured on something like the Arogya Setu app, which by the way already has 100 million users, would be a huge competitive advantage for services and companies which are listed and referred to by the Arogya Setu app. For these reasons, you've seen opposition to integration of telemedicine with Arogya Setu come not just from privacy advocates like ourselves, but also from other small telemedicine companies and physical offline pharmacies. So, for instance, some telemedicine companies have privately told journalists, and for this, I would definitely recommend that all of you read an article which has been published by the Ken, which details this in, and introduces you to the whole cast of characters. But basically, smaller telemedicine companies have been reporting that they are feeling pressurized to join certain alliances. One of the services which have been listed on the Arogya Setu Mitra portal is the Swasth Alliance, which is led by executives from Practo, 1mg and Curefit. And smaller telemedicine companies report that they're being discouraged from independently listing their services without joining this alliance. And they're also reluctant to join this alliance and share data about their doctors with bigger companies, because then bigger companies will know which doctors are earning the most revenue and are most profitable and could therefore end up poaching them. I think from a privacy perspective, the involvement of private industry volunteers in the development of an app which is collecting sensitive health data and real-time location data of millions of Indians without any transparency or public discussion is extremely concerning. The government has recently been complimented for making the Arogya Setu source code publicly available on GitHub, but I think that doesn't address a lot of fundamental design problems in the app itself. So, for instance, the fact that the app at some point people decided would have a centralized model where a user's data could be uploaded to a government server without their consent is what makes the app very likely to be used as a tool of mass surveillance. And these are problems that you cannot fix at a belated stage by just making the app open source. I'm sure Srinivas will also talk more about why the app is truly or fully open source. So we'll leave that for later. But I think a good comparator or a good example of how private sector can also contribute during these times is the Google Apple API for proximity exposure notification app. Now, just before I start, I don't want to give these companies too much credit because their own record on privacy has been quite spotty. But I think Google and Apple, when they were developing their own app, were much more responsive, where a user's data is not uploaded to the government server without the user's explicit consent. These companies also decided that if their API was going to be used by any country, that country could not insist on location tracking through GPS data. And they faced a lot of backlash for this from various countries, including countries in the European Union, who refuse to use the API on this ground. And I think this shows us that it is possible to have private sector involved, but it needs to be done in a transparent and rights-respecting manner. I know a lot of people think that privacy researchers are just a particularly paranoid breed of individuals who are always talking about these harms which are speculative and remote. But I think that's very myopic, because we need to understand that just because at this stage we can't fully exhaustively list all the ways in which data can be misused, it doesn't mean that risk doesn't exist. I think a very good example of this is, for instance, misuse of vehicle registration data in the Vahan database, which was sold by the Ministry of Transport to private players. Now, a very obvious harm of this would be that you could be subjected to targeted advertising, which some people believe isn't a life or death matter. So why be so bothered about it? But I think during the Delhi riots, we also witnessed how vehicle registration data could also be used to target vehicles of people belonging to minority communities and then destroy them. Because in India, if you know somebody's name, you very often know their religion and you can figure out their caste. So I think it's very important for us to remember that this data will be misused if it's out there, and it will be misused in manners that affect different sections of society differently. I think on this point, I would encourage everybody to read the statement which has recently been released by the Indian Federation of App-Based Transport Workers opposing use of Arogya Setu. In that statement, the group has very incisively highlighted that if private companies had access to location data of their workers, they could very easily identify who were quote unquote troublemakers or people who were, trying to organize and form unions and then crack down upon their meetings and efforts to collectivize. Similarly, if private companies had access to health data, they could use this data to tailor the amount of work which is given to each worker and also terminate their services if they feel that this person is likely to contract COVID and then develop complications which we just don't want to pay for. So, and I would definitely encourage all of you to read the statement in its entirety. I think I will stop for now because I think I've given a background of where I'm coming from and my experience with these issues. And I really want to hear what Ritika and Srinivas have to say. They've been, as I said, addressing issues of regulatory capture by private industries since the days of Aadhaar and India Stack. Ritika, maybe we'll start with you. What do you think about the role that private industry has played?
Okay, so I thought I'll come to that eventually, but I thought let me start quickly by talking about just very briefly about the health sector and Arogya Setu, and then zooming out to some of the issues that you asked about. So, in economics, there are some sectors that are seen as being appropriate for the private market. So, maybe manufacturing and, the market for shoes or clothes or even motor vehicles, etc. But there are also sectors that are seen as being inappropriate and for the private market. And in fact, areas where the government should play a proactive role, maybe the dominant role, maybe even a monopoly role. And health and education are two big examples of that, where these sectors, if left to the private market, will lead to suboptimal outcomes in the sense that there might be an undersupply of these services, but also more serious consequences in terms of equity. Right? So if you have private schools only, then only those who can pay will be able to access schooling. And then if quality is tied to how much you can pay, then that clearly means, the objective of social justice and equality is not going to be very well served. So healthcare is also seen as being a very important area of operation for the government. For the same reason as education, because we care about social justice and equality, but also because there are very serious information asymmetry issues. Yeah, so if you're sick as a layperson, you don't necessarily know what is the problem, and the doctor and the medical system know much more than you, and they might be able to exploit that system to in a way that's not best is not in your interest, and therefore it's seen as being something that should be kept out of the market, should not be a monetized kind of service. Of course, even healthcare is paid for through taxes and other revenues generated by the government. So because of that, if there are developments in society, in the economy, etc., that legitimize or give the private sector an upper hand in the area of healthcare or education for that matter, then it is a matter of concern for all of us. It shouldn't be a matter of concern only for the poor, it should be a matter of concern for everyone. I like to say this all the time these days. George Orwell said it when he was alive. He said, either we all live in a decent world or nobody does. Yeah, so if you and I are okay, but we see migrants suffering the way they have been subjected to all these indignities over the past few weeks. It's just not okay. And it's the same with healthcare. What's happened is that, of course, a lot of these things have always been around, but nobody bothered to pay attention to them. And suddenly now mainstream media is also forced to pay attention to them. So this Arogya Setu, which is the the reason why this whole conversation was triggered off, is an app that pretends to be serving the public good in terms of helping, in terms of for contact tracing with COVID-19 patients and and in India, the ownership of smartphones is between 17 to 33%, about one maximum, according to some estimates, 1/3 of the population has smartphones, and the lower limit is 17%. Yeah. So, and for this Bluetooth technology to work for contact tracing, even with all its limitations like the false positives, it needs a penetration of about 60%. 50 to 60% people need to have smartphones. So why is the government then pushing this app down people's throats? That is a big question. And very likely it is because there's some designs to not only monetize the data that they are able to get through this app. I don't know the details of what is to be submitted at the time of enlisting yourself or downloading the app, or what can be harvested through surreptitious means once the app is on your phone. But certainly monetization of the data is part of the plan for sure. I wouldn't be surprised if somebody has already started using it. And then of course there is the danger that the government will use this data in certain ways. And then the third thing is also peer-to-peer surveillance. Yeah, this is another very dangerous thing that has happened in the context of this rising digitization of so many different aspects of our lives. Yeah, that much more is available in the digital world. And, even on Facebook, people are telling on each other and landing others into trouble. And not all of this is being done in the public interest, obviously. Yeah. So, so I thought I did want to say just that little bit about Arogya Setu and the healthcare sector, and why we should worry if telemedicine or Arogya Setu or any of these things, if they are strengthening the hand of private players. And also in the healthcare sector, I should add, many countries or most countries have some element of private healthcare, right? But even in those countries, private healthcare is very strictly regulated. So if you look at Germany or Japan, there are in Germany, there are social insurance funds, but a lot of the doctors are private doctors. They're not paid salaries by the government, in the case of the National Health Service. But in these countries like Germany and Japan, the rate that the doctor can charge you for a particular service, for a visit, etc., is very strictly regulated. In Japan, there's a thick manual which lists out, even if your cut is a 1-inch cut, then this is what you should be charged. Yeah. In the Indian case, the health sector, the private health sector, which is very large, is also almost entirely unregulated in practical terms. Huh? I mean, in theory, of course, there is some kind of, yeah. Okay, so moving on, this is a problem that's not limited to the health sector only. This is, like you said, more and more areas of our lives are being marketized, and first of all, they're being digitized also because of the development of, the rise of these technologies. And then a lot of it is getting marketized, even in areas that are not seen as being good for marketization. And in fact, now there are some people also, there was like some loose talk about creating a market, like there's a missing market as far as privacy is concerned, and those who care so much about their privacy should start paying, for their data not being. So like we were having a little discussion before this, it seems that Zoom now doesn't want to offer end-to-end encryption for its free users, and if you want your privacy, then you pay for this. Maybe that's not such a great example, but we should know that this increasing digitization, it seems, it is actually, it's not just seems, it is a huge convenience, it is a service, it is something we value, but it also comes with certain costs. Let me give a few examples which might resonate with others. So on my phone, I often get WhatsApp messages, SMSs, which will say, grow, help your hair grow, get rid of baldness, lose weight in 20 kilos in 3 days, or buy a house, or earn 20,000 rupees a month just sitting at home, etc. So why are these SMSs coming to me? And then of course, because I was working on Aadhaar and all of these issues, the penny dropped one day, and I realized that somebody somewhere down the line had leaked my phone number and sold it on the market. And that now that phone number is just going around all over the place. And of course, we get a lot of spam on email as well. And some of these things are benign. I mean, they're not benign, they're harmless. They may not necessarily hurt us, but some of these things are pretty vicious. And Cathy O'Neil, for instance, in her book, Weapons of Mass Destruction, she lists out how some of these targeted advertising moves can land people in a lot of trouble. They may end up taking loans that they're not well placed to repay. So the loan sharks get them. And these things have started happening in India as well. So if you look at that Hindu article, there is one example of ICICI selling insurance policies to unsuspecting customers. So data can become toxic very quickly, and it can be used against you very quickly. And like, the example that you gave earlier is quite important. Like if my name was Ritika Khan, you might be able to guess quite quickly what my religion is, so that even if the government says that we're not selling data on religion, or we're not collecting data on religion, we can immediately reveal and de-anonymize my identity. Similarly, if I was called Ritika Paswan, you would know quite quickly, if you were a North Indian, that I'm Dalit. So there, it seems like innocuous data, but it may not be innocuous data. That's one part of it. The second, of course, is that there's no data protection law at all. Yeah, it's all a free for all right now. But I would say that even if we get a good data protection law, I am not very convinced that this is going to be very helpful in the Indian context. First of all, like you said also earlier, that even the data protection law process, drafting process has been compromised and has been criticized for that reason. We know that the government is doing everything it can to facilitate the growth of private industries, even if it comes at the cost of people's well-being. And they're not showing much care, attention to people's the harm that comes to people as a result of this. But the second part of the story is that suppose by magic we get a data protection law that's even better than the GDPR. I'm not very convinced that this will be very helpful in the Indian context, because of the low levels of tech and digital literacy in the country, and legal literacy also, right? So I'm very influenced by one incident that happened many years ago with me. But will you tell me quickly if I'm talking too much? Who's keeping time?
Please continue.
Okay, so many years ago we were in Sonbhadra district of UP, and we just happened to meet an NREGA Mazdoor, a laborer, who was owed like some maybe 20,000 rupees, a very large sum from his point of view, and somehow we managed, over a few weeks' time, he managed to get paid. So the next time that we met him, we were, of course, very delighted to hear that he had got his due wages. And then so we said, what did you do with this money? And he said, मैंने उसको invest कर दिया, I invested it. And so we were like, wow, that's really good that, he saved the money and put it somewhere. So we said, what did you invest it in? And he went and got out a piece of paper, which was just complete rubbish. There was not even a phone number on it. And basically some fly-by-night operator may have been informed by the block office that this laborer is getting 20,000 rupees. And this innocent person, he just handed over the money thinking he was doing the right thing. Forget about an NREGA worker in UP. Even my mother, if she's reasonably well educated, but she's not going to be able to handle the tech world with quite as much ease as we do. So even if we have good data protection laws, how many people will actually be able to understand the rights and assert them? And even when they do that, what kind of rule of law do we have in the country? How accessible is justice going to be in those cases? All of these are major concerns. So what we find, what is very disturbing about the debate, and of course I'm coming from my research on Aadhaar and what it did for the, especially the public distribution system, NREGA and social security pensions, and how much trouble it has caused and how much anxiety it causes on a monthly basis to people who survive, many of them who survive on these forms of social support. What is very disturbing is that the government is supposed to protect our rights against such corporate greed as we are seeing in all these different domains. But what we're finding in the Indian context is that the government is jumping onto the same bandwagon as corporations. And it's like both of them against us. Yeah, it's the corporate might, government power against citizen and people power. And so far, unfortunately, it's not been such an even fight. But I should add, and then maybe I'll stop and say that, look, with Aadhaar, it took us 10 years or maybe 8 years to reach a point where people would begin to understand where this was going and what its real intentions were. Yeah, the whole facade of public welfare didn't go away for many people until 7 or 8 years into the project. Around 2017 is when things started changing. But if you compare that with the Arogya Setu app and the discussion around it, it's quite incredible, right? Because within 7 days, forget 7 weeks or 7 months, or it's very far from 7 years is what it took for Aadhaar. Within 7 days, people were shouting from rooftops or whatever on their Twitter handles. And the government had to, start shuffling its feet, if not backtracking. So, the whole thing was exposed very quickly by informed citizens. Everyone was really quick to understand that, this veneer of doing something in the public good is only a veneer after all. So I think these battles, of course, are long-run battles. But I do think that the conversation has shifted just a little bit in our favor. Okay, I'll stop with that.
Srinivas, would you like to add something to what Professor Khera has said?
Right. So, to essentially explain, there is a why is the reason that you are seeing the rise of these apps or rise of techno-solutionism, right? Like, clearly we have a healthcare crisis on our hands, and everyone knows that the only response to this unknown virus is that you wash your hands, you wear a mask, and anything anything else that you do will not help hygiene and to ensure that you don't come in contact with someone who's potentially positive with the virus. And to tackle this virus, what any nation state would do is it would set up new hospitals, it would set up new beds, provide masks to doctors, personal protection equipment that the doctors and nurses need, and potentially make and give free masks to everyone, people who can't afford mask, right? But instead, what you're seeing is that people are being asked to install an app, and they're blindly being made to believe that if you install this app, everything will be all right. But the fact remains that you are not being tested. Like if you're in any part of the country right now, I'm in Hyderabad, I can't get tested easily. Telangana is one of the under-tested regions in the country. I mean, I'm hearing the same about Delhi, where the Delhi government has asked private labs to not to test to ensure. If the idea about these apps or data in general is to bring in this whole form of data-driven governance, right? Like data in healthcare and government across the world, right? I'm not saying that it's just the government of Telangana, government of Delhi, or government of India, but you see the same pattern repeating in the US and elsewhere as well. No government wants to test so that they can say that the numbers are not high. They're hoping the in all of this is they're trying to use this crisis to push this personal agenda of few corporate interests to push the Arogya Setu app. The reason I say this is because the Arogya Setu app, we all know it doesn't work when not everyone uses this, and not everyone can use it. And at the same time, it's not the only solution. You've seen that people are trying to bring in drone surveillance, people are trying to bring in thermal cameras to find out your body temperatures. And you see that the police departments are trying to use image processing to look at if you're wearing a mask or not and to fine you. I mean, clearly, if I have a mask, I'll wear it. If I don't have it, I can't. So I would rather like the state to give me a mask rather than fining me, right? Like, sure, if you have provided masks to everyone and they're not wearing it, you can definitely fine them. Nobody's questioning that. But clearly, we are diverting a huge portion of resources during a healthcare crisis to unnecessary spending, right? I mean, there's a huge demand in the US right now with the ongoing crisis that why are we funding the police in the first place when we have a healthcare crisis? Maybe we should give a lot of funding to healthcare to bring in more hospitals to test more people. Clearly, that's one of the reasons why we are not testing them. There is not enough resources. You're not, and if you look at India's personal healthcare sector, as Ritika was out, it's a lot of it is privatized. Nobody wants to go to a government hospital, especially the middle class. Anybody with an actual emergency will not go to a government hospital. They know they will not be provided enough care. Instead of that, you are seeing an increased push by the government in terms of the telemedicine setups. Even in this case, the idea is not that you will push some of these telemedicine systems in government hospitals, but actually privatize it. And if you look at the models that the direct benefit transfer and Aadhaar have led to in healthcare, was primarily insurance led. The whole Ayushman Bharat scheme, what essentially it does is if you want to get treated, you can go to a private hospital and get treated. And the private hospital will essentially get reimbursed by an insurance company through Government of India. But you're not making any and actual healthcare infrastructure funding, right? You're not creating more government hospitals. You're not training more doctors. You're not training more nurses. And clearly, if anything that we have learned through this pandemic is Kerala with its social welfare systems has a really good healthcare setup, which it has achieved over decades. And any privatization of these systems, essential systems, is not helpful in the long term, and especially in scenarios like a crisis, right? So in such a case, the whole push. If you look at the whole list of people who volunteered to build the Arogya Setu app, mind you, this app was not built by the National Informatics Centers. It was actually built by a set of volunteers from the private sector. And the list of these volunteers has been made public when the source code of the app was made public. Only after people demanded that you tell us what this app actually does, show us the source code, then you realize that yes, this app was developed by a bunch of 50 individuals. Otherwise, you would never know who built this app. Except now you realize some of these individuals are also building on what is called the National Health Stack. And some of these people are volunteers of this industry lobby group called iSpert, Indian Software Product Roundtable, Industry Roundtable, Indian Software Products Industry Roundtable. And so iSpert is essentially a set of volunteers who built the Aadhaar project, who later then formed iSpert in 2013, once they built Aadhaar and they quit the Aadhaar UIDAI. And since then, they've created something called UPI. They've pushed all of this Aadhaar, UPI, eKYC, eSign, and Digital Locker under a brand called India Stack. And now, on the similar lines of India Stack, you have Health Stack. So what you're witnessing is you have an identity layer of Aadhaar, then you have a payment layer, now you have the healthcare layer. And these people are essentially building infrastructure stacks. So that's what they call stacks as. For a digital infrastructure. In doing so, they claim they're building it for free. All the volunteers who built Arogya Setu claim they did it for free, except some of these individuals belong to healthcare companies like 1mg. Essentially, it's a set of companies who could benefit from telemedicine. And they're building this infrastructure for free, and they were the ones who get to have a right of access. I mean, this is what usually happens in any public-private partnership, right? Like, say, if you want to build a port, you have the land, you let a private company invest, bring in money to build a port, and you let the private company to actually operate the port over a period of time. Let the private sector decide the charges it wants to charge anyone who wants to use a port. And after that 30-year period of time, the government takes over, right? Like, you have the time to build, operate, and transfer it to the government. There is a clear set of agreement, there is a tendering process that happens, and there is a contract. But in this case of this building these digital infrastructures, there is no contract. These people are volunteering, and they're volunteering, but they're getting paid by these companies where they're working to build it. Or the companies donate to these that group, iSpert, Indian Software Products Industry Roundtable again. And once they build it, only a few set of people get access to the application programming interfaces, the APIs of these digital infrastructures, which is essentially, I can go build a port, I will spend my money on government land. There is no agreement, there is an informal agreement between me and the government to use the free land. Then what I'm doing is, then I'm starting to trade oil in it. I'm bringing in lots of oil and it's leaking everywhere. So it's essentially impacting the environmental loss. If I have to compare, when everyone says data is the oil, and if I have to compare actual oil to data, so what essentially these companies are doing is they're doing everything and anything at their will, impacting how oil impacts the environment. You have our personal data being forcefully taken by us when they make something like Arogya Setu or Aadhaar mandatory, and they're using it for their personal gains. Except when it leaks, they are like, oh, it's not our responsibility. When an oil leak happens, it's not the private sector which is going up and cleaning it. It's usually the public sector. It's the environment agencies, whether it's the pollution boards or whether it's the civil society, right? So what you're witnessing in all of this is, I would call all of this a scam. In the same way what Aadhaar was, it's a giant infrastructure scam, except because the infrastructure is in the digital world, which you can't see, one can't notice it. If you, I mean, think of this, if someone was building a all new airport and operating goods illegally, it would be an occupation on the nation state,
and the nation would react very firmly against it, right? And you are seeing that happen in similar ways in the digital world. And what you're witnessing at the same time is there is this concept called eminent domain. The legal scholar Rusha Ramanathan actually says this, right? Like in case of land, the government can claim that it has eminent domain, which is that all land belongs to government of India. When it needs for national development, it can take it back, whether it's for laying a road, whether it's for port developments, whether it's for railroad development. You're witnessing government extending that to human bodies, to every Indian's bodies. And literally when I say bodies, your biometrics, your health data, your personal data, everything and anything. And that's not how it works. You can't expand eminent domain to human bodies because you own your body. That's what feminism, all the feminist movements, all rights movements have taught us, right? Like whether it's labor rights, when you fought against bonded labor, all the history of rights movements is taught us is that humans own their body, they're born free. No one can control them or no one can force them to do except when there is a law. And now you're seeing that even when these systems are being built, when Aadhaar was built, there is no law. When UPI was built, somehow they put it under one of the financial acts, but it was a money bill probably. In case of health stack, you don't have anything. For Arogya Setu to be made mandatory, you don't have a law. I mean, even the right to privacy judgment clearly says that you need a privacy law, and you also need laws for each of these systems when you want to make it mandatory, right? And it's not just making it mandatory. I mean, if you look at the UK is also trying to look at these contact tracing apps. The parliament has come out with a report which actually says that you need to bring a law for this. You can't just simply have these systems. And none of these things are happening. And the reason it is so is because some of these private players who are able to influence the government in building these systems are able to convince everyone else inside the government this is for their good thing. And there is a clear belief that technology will solve everything. Inside government, specifically when the Prime Minister says that all of these things are going to solve your healthcare issues at the same way Aadhaar solved our money laundering issues, our black money issues, demonetization has solved some of these issues. The same way, if we have to believe Arogya Setu is going to solve a corona crisis, it's just the government trying to fool us again. And the private sector is on all of it because they have a lot to gain through it. I'll end it there, but I can talk more.
I was just wondering if you would also like to highlight some of your findings based on, RTI requests, because I know that you filed a lot of right to information requests to bring greater transparency into this private involvement in building of government data projects. And how do you think the government has responded to these requests? Have they, been transparent and shared information, or have they been very evasive?
Okay, so to go back to one of the examples which Ritika was pointing out, right? Like for this individual who is supposed to get his DBT, direct benefit transfer money, not everyone knows when it's going to come, and if it doesn't come, they don't know where the error is. These are essentially technology systems, and they do have errors, right? I mean, I don't know if any of you have faced any sort of errors with Arogya Setu. You could face one if you are using a different phone. Like Android has so many varieties, and not always the apps work, right? So in case of DBT, you had these errors, and a lot of people actually do not get money because of these errors. For almost 10 years now, we had no idea on the error amount, right? How many errors are there? What's the actual amount of error money that was going through? I mean, even during the Aadhaar challenge in the Supreme Court, no data was present. Only now the government's responding post the Aadhaar case, they're responding that how much is the money that's not being credited to the accounts of these individuals, and how much of the percentage of errors that exists. At the same time, the reason they haven't done this, it's not in public domain, is because all these systems are closed. Traditionally, technology systems are closed, even with with Arogya Setu, there were a lot of claims, right? The app will do this, the app will do that. We didn't know how the app even worked until they made the app source code public. Even now, there is not a lot of clarity because we do not have the server sides of the app. So the app entirely hasn't been made public yet. So when you look at some of these systems, these issues being extended across India's digital platforms, whether it's Aadhaar, GSTN, take the case of GSTN. Nobody knows how much money the state is contributing to the center and how much is the center giving back to the state. There is no transparency, and all of this is digitalized. And there are so many issues when the individual tries to file some of these GST monthly tax payments. It's so hard, right? So the involvement of the private sector, in case of GSTN, at least you have that there is a contract between Infosys and the government of India. Infosys, I believe there's multiple, even TCS is involved. There is a consortium. So there is an actual agreement between these parties. Then you have states, then you have center, each of them sharing a different amount of stake in, because GSTN is a private body. The goods and service tax, even though as a tax is a concept, the goods and service tax network, which is a network of computing systems which should collect these tax payments, is a private organization and which almost functions as a private organization. If you look at the National Payments Corporation of India, which does all of your payments, which is the only body which is doing it, it is also a private body. So most of the times these systems are being built outside the government. So it's hardly that you can file an RTI with them or make them hold them accountable, because in the recent past, the CIC has actually come out and said that NPCI is not under RTI because it's a private body. But NPCI is the only body which handles all of the DBT transactions. It handles all of your payments. Similarly, if something like the National Health Authority, if it is, say, set up with the public-private partnership, you could say that all of your health data is with them, and we can't file an RTI with these bodies because they're not under the government per se. The government and the private sector are specifically designing these systems to evade any accountability while they're building these systems. And if your payment bounces in UPI, I don't know how many of you face this issue, but it's not easy to get it back. Even though there is some level of professionalism, sometimes it's so hard to find out depending upon what app you're using. Something like Google Pay, probably they're doing it better, but if you're using some unknown UPI app, it's sometimes hard. So it's up to the private player, right? So what it has done in the end of the day, what technology is doing is when, as an individual, you're approaching the government, you're trying to interact with the government as a citizen, you have a middleman suddenly. And the middleman, which is a system or even a private player, which treats you as a consumer. For UPI, you're a consumer. For you're soon going to become a consumer through National Health Stack. For Aadhaar, you are again a consumer because you're going through a bank, you're going through a telecom company, you don't interact with UIDAIs directly. So all these systems are trying to evade oversight at some level. And even after filing a lot of RTIs, what we can only see is that there is no formal agreements. And even if you look at India's tax own website, they've removed this now. But if someone wants to look at it, you can go to their Wayback Machine on Internet Archive and you can look at it. In 2018, iSpert essentially said they're industry volunteers and they build these systems when the government invites them, right? Through an informal agreement. But if that's the case, I think I can always build my own telecom network through an informal agreement, right? There is a reason why we have regulatory systems, and we understand that these systems need to be regulated because there are challenges. And in case of telecom, you realize that the private companies are profiting so much, you started selling spectrum. And the selling to spectrum is essentially you're selling a license. You're not even selling anything real. In this case, our data is being actually shared with them, actually being sold, and a lot of the times for free. In case of Aadhaar, for a really long period of time, for 2 years, UIDAI never charged a single rupee to these private companies for accessing Aadhaar data while they profited from it, right? So if one has to sell this data, bring a law, probably even auction it. Why is it that these specific individuals of this lobby group, iSpert, is the only, and their friends, the only set of people who must get it? There is no transparency in this process. There is no accountability in it, which is the reason I call this a big scam. If one has to quantify it, if one is saying that Aadhaar is valued at $50 billion, then that's the level of the scam. You essentially have built it for free and you have privatized it to a larger extent.
Thank you, Srinivas. I would just like to ask Kaushik, who's the host from IITM, if it's possible for the members who are attending this event to maybe post questions in a chat box, because I can't seem to see a chat box. If that's not possible, maybe audience members could raise their hand and then Kaushik could unmute them so they could ask the question. Kaushik, would that be possible?
Yes, yes, that I think should be possible. I think there's an option, there should be an option to raise your hand. I think there should be an option.
Yes, so if anyone has...
There is a reactions, yeah.
Yes, there is also a raise hand option. And if you raise your hand, I think Kaushik will then unmute you so you can ask the question. Would that work, Kaushik?
Yeah, yeah, that should work. That should work. Yeah.
Okay.
So,
I mean, I have a couple of questions myself. So maybe I'll start with my questions, and as and when somebody raises their hand, Kaushik, please let me know and we can unmute them and let them ask the question as well. So my first question is to Srinivas, because a lot of what you were saying was extremely thought-provoking and it gave me a lot of perspective about this issue. Do you think that maybe lack of technical talent within the government itself is maybe one of the reasons why the government is so willing and eager to rely on private volunteers? Can you not hear me? Am I audible now?
Hello?
Am I audible, Kaushik?
Yeah, Devdatta, you're audible. You're audible. You're audible. Devdatta is audible.
Okay, I think Srinivas can't hear me. Srinivas, can you hear me?
Oh, okay. Sorry. Yeah. Srinivas. Yeah. Srinivas muted. Yeah. Just wait a second. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
So yeah.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah, the unmuting is a little problem.
Sorry,
yes,
you have.
Yeah, please get back. Please get
You
back.
have to.
Sorry.
Yeah, you also have to unmute Ritika. So yeah. So the question. I'm sorry. What was the question? Can you just repeat it? Sorry.
Yeah, I was just wondering if you think maybe
Lack of
technical
expertise.
talent within
Okay.
the government.
Yeah. So, okay. So let me give you a sense of India's expertise and computational challenges, right? Like if you look at India's 1947, during when we got freedom, you have computers, you have the IBM computers, which the Nazis used during the World War. So you had some level of computation which just emerged, right? Like you were using cryptographic systems to encrypt messages, code them for war. That's where all of your systems have, the need for computing even emerged, right? National security. I think the early stages of the reason I'm bringing this is because of the issues of sovereignty and why we need computing. The early days of Indian computing systems were evolved because of our own needs for a nuclear program, because you wanted to control nuclear reactors. It was primarily led by TIFR, the Tata Institute of Fundamental Research, under Homi Bhabha. Right, so you never had our own domestic capacity to manufacture them, but it was needed, so you built them. TIFR actually built some of these systems, but it was largely IBM's monopoly in very early days. And eventually, IBM exited the country, and we kind of made our own infrastructure setup. Like we got Electronics Corporation of India Limited, which built our own systems and components. You had the National Informatics Center, which tried to bring in our own computing skills. So any nation state would ideally want to develop these skills and the expertise in computing, because you need it for a wide range of things. In case of these whole building of private enterprises or digital platforms that we're seeing right now, it's happening primarily in the way US or China helped their own big tech to upcome. You had the rise of the American big tech, which worked on the banks of the Silicon Valley because they are the ones who built microchips and processors, and they had the capacity to build these new mobile devices. So essentially, systems which were developed by the US Department of Defense, whether it's the internet in itself through ARPANET and all of it, there was at some level they developed because of US government's backing. And when you look at China, China took a different route and helped their own companies like Alibaba and all by banning US companies, right? They're like, we will promote our domestic companies. And all of this, we're calling the fourth industrial revolution, right? If you had the first industrial revolution was what's happened in Britain in the 18th century, between 18th and 19th century, the rise of railroads and cotton being the raw material which powered all of it from India, right? So data is being seen as the raw material to power any big tech. So you are witnessing a power grab, a sort of colonization tactic that has happened during the first industrial revolution, where you needed land to get raw material so that they can power the industrial revolution in Britain. Within the cyberspace, there is a push to grab it, right? In terms of who controls the internet, essentially controls this fifth dimension. And Indian government realized it doesn't have this capacity, and it is thus trying to promote its own Indian big tech. And it's visible when you see the push for Geo, the rise of Geo, the push for UPI apps. All of these is because India in a situation where it can compete American big tech and Chinese big tech. And they know they can't build it, which is why you have Nandan Nilekani, who built Aadhaar, coming from the private sector, helping them. And in fact, the entire vision for this health stack, the UPI systems, have all been written by Mr. Nilekani through a report called the TAGUP report, the Technology Advisories Group. I think Ritika can add more to that. But in terms of the lack of expertise inside the government of India, it's been known. I'm not denying that it doesn't exist, but if it wants to increase that, I think it needs to hire more people and probably build our own systems, right? You build a state capitalism model where you have your own centers like ECIL, which are wholly owned by the government. But this whole public-private partnership where the liability comes to the public and only profits go to the private sector is really problematic, because these people who claim to be the experts are also clearly not the experts, because if they were, they wouldn't have designed some of these broken systems. To me, Aadhaar is a broken system because there are so many errors in it. I mean, by design, biometrics are not always authenticated. If you go and look for the error codes on UIDS page, you'll find that it alone has 99 error codes.
Professor Khera, would you maybe like to add to that and tell us a little bit more about the TAGUP report that Srinivas mentioned? I also have a follow-up question for you, and this is something we realized when we were doing a little bit of the work around Arogya Setu. And the government was insisting, or rather this seems to be the reason, that they need access to location data to be able to figure out certain hotspots. But I mean, they already have a lot of data about, where people are getting COVID based on information that they're getting from hospitals and labs and through the integrated disease surveillance network that already exists. So have there been similar concerns even in the welfare context, where the government already has a lot of data which it is not using properly, but it's also insisting on collecting new data through more invasive projects? Professor Khera?
Yeah. Okay, I'm on unmute now. So I think this hype around technology and the use of technology in welfare systems especially suits the government. You were, this was the question you asked, Srinivas. It suits the government because they can be seen to be doing something I think they were very happy when the Arogya Setu app was developed and it went around and even in international news, like India is at the forefront of fighting COVID. So it suits the government to appear to be doing something and, very proactively and actually even succeeding without actually doing anything that matters at all on the ground. So let me give you, let me use this chance to talk about something that's related in the field of welfare. See, this migrant crisis, okay? All of us are seeing just how terrible, how badly they've been treated by the government. If the government had any clue about their situation, then the government would first have announced some kind of relief measures and given them a reassurance, and then announced the lockdown. What happened here is that the announcement of the lockdown was like this big suspenseful event that was built up through all media channels, etc. And it was, this is not the time to shock and awe people. This is the time to reassure them, because we know that a very large chunk is in this situation. So what happened is that we find that these millions of migrants now and workers in cities, not just migrants, are in really bad situation. And again, there's a huge furor because finally the mainstream media has to pay attention to this issue. And so what does the government do? It doesn't do the most obvious things. The most obvious things to do right now is to use the excess food stocks and give it to people who don't have ration cards, the people who are stuck in cities, either give them dry rations or open community kitchens, or issue them new ration cards, because there is availability of grain at the moment, yeah? And these are more straightforward things to do. But what does the government do? It announces one nation, one ration. Now, that's a really foul idea because we know what the experience with Aadhaar integration in the PDS has been. But one nation, one ration is going to escalate. This PDS has served as a lifeline and saved, I don't know how many lives in these past few weeks, because it actually functions. Even if not perfectly, it functions. And what is going to happen, or is likely to happen rather, with one nation, one ration, is that this may get disrupted, because first of all, you need Aadhaar to do this, authentication elsewhere. And we know that, as Kodali already said, authentication failures are high. But more than that, if I'm, there's some survey which is showing that many of the migrants or workers who were stuck in cities don't even have ration cards. So how does portability or one nation, one ration help them at all in the first place? You need to give them a ration card first for them to avail of the benefit of one nation, one ration. The idea is basically, even if you're a laborer from Bihar and working in a city like Delhi, then you can buy your rations here. And we find that many of them may not have a ration card in the first place. Many of them don't come with their whole family, right? It's often always the men who are coming to the cities, and their families stay behind. So they won't carry the ration card with them. The ration card is going to be back in the village. So how are you going to make it available to this person in the city? Now, the technology for this may exist, yeah? And in their technological la-la land, it's all going to work really well in their flow charts and, animated kind of things. It's going to work out really nicely. But on the ground, what is more likely to happen? The Mazdoor in city, wherever, from Araria, is going to try and buy his grain here. And instead of putting one person's grain in the system, the dealer here will put all 5 family members' names, right? And then when this man, his family members, whether it's his mother or wife or whoever, go to buy grains back in the village, they'll be told, your grain has already been taken, just go away. Even if, and both sides may end up getting cheated also. There's even more complications. Tamil Nadu, for instance, gives free rice. Yeah, and in Bihar, you have to pay 3 rupees for it. So if a Bihari laborer buys in Chennai, is he going to get it free, or is he going to have to pay 3 rupees? In Chennai, people will get dal and oil also. So now, but that's coming from the state budget, So is the Bihari laborer now going to get dal and oil or not? So they, instead of focusing on the real issue, what they do is this shock and awe kind of thing, and everyone thinks, oh my God, if only we had one nation, one ration at the moment, everything would have been fine. And in fact, it is something that may even derail this kind of reasonably functional PDS system. So it suits the government to have these really slick and cool, not just tech solutions, but it's also like the manner of, the impression about the government is that it's clunky and slow and all of that. Maybe there's some merit to being slow, because democratic consensus and practices do take time, especially in such a big country. So, so as far as data is concerned, you said, do they already have the data? And then they still, yeah, this is all over the place. If there is a will to do something, you don't even need data. And I don't want to give this Delhi government a big pat on the back at all. I know there are huge problems there, but I've just moved in the middle of the lockdown. I moved from Ahmedabad to Delhi, and I've, in the few times that I've gone out, I've always noticed some kind of food distribution, either cooked food or sacks of wheat, just, under a tarpaulin being in some corners, and people coming to get it. These are people who don't have ration cards, and the state government has found some. There are huge problems with what Delhi government is doing, not just with the PDS, but otherwise. But the fact is that they're also doing a little bit, some of the things that we care about, and they're managing to do it without building a database first. Yeah. So the database is actually, it's important to have information within limits, but if you want to do stuff, you can actually do it without data. And all these civil society initiatives show you that very clearly. So many people we know have been reaching out to people who are stuck, and trying to help them out. So the conflict of interest with this whole tech takeover of the government is just really mind-blowing. And I said that at the beginning, right? The government is supposed to be a wall between corporate greed and citizens' interests, but in our case, we are not seeing that at all. And it's not just an India phenomena, right? I mean, this corporations, tech companies, look at the US and look at the amount of money Alphabet and others are spending on lobbying the government. Yeah, so it's not just that the government lacks, this was the question you asked, Srinivas, is it because they lack the capacity within government that, this becomes an easy fallback option? These companies are proactively making inroads into government, using public money, our money, to build platforms and systems that they then leave, after they leave government, they then exploit to the fullest. And I'm not saying this. This is a passage from a book by Nilekani and Shah, his co-author. It's a really nice passage. MS Sriram has pulled out that passage, and it's in that edited book, Descent on Aadhaar, where he says how how you should operate. Keep the pretense of democracy and democratic, practices going. Attend all the meetings, do all the consultations, and all of that. But meanwhile, don't lose track of why you got into government. And internationally, you see that. Look at Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Their money is going to universities. Their money is going to mainstream media. Of course, there's all kinds of, NGO kind of funding, philanthropy, etc. But what that means is that all these institutions are not becoming beholden to BMGF, but it takes the edge off your criticism. If in the past sometimes you've got a bit of funding, so who's doing that in India? You should ask yourself, who's the Bill Gates or Media Network for that matter, and they don't necessarily hide these things very much. It's all out there for us to read and to connect the dots. It's the connecting of the dots that takes a bit of time.
Thank you, Professor Khera. I have a lot more questions for both of you, but I will hold my reins because I see someone from the audience has their hand up. So maybe Kaushik, you could unmute them, and more audience members who want to ask questions could also raise their hand.
Yeah, Devdutt, I unmute them. Before that, I just want to make a small announcement. People may not know this. So if somebody wants to raise your hand, click the participants button at the bottom of your tab, which will open the list of participants. And at the bottom of the participants list, you will see a button with 3 dots. You click the dots, you can see a menu in which you can see the option to raise your hand. So yeah, please use that option. Now I'll actually, unmute the participants one by one so that they can put forward their questions. So
hi, first of all, thank you for this session. I am Kannan. See, I think a lot of these solutions, digital solutions that come across, are also because of lazy bureaucratic innovation that we have encouraged over a period of time. You will see a lot of awards being given for such apps, a lot of every single step that is being taken without any consideration for privacy, for consideration for other things, is also to do with that limited set of ideas and this pressure to give something innovative immediately. So app becomes the easiest thing to do that, and that's why one of the reasons. And second aspect of it is this 100%, we have to reach the 100% everywhere. So Aadhaar, so 100% Aadhaar penetration. 95% should be a good enough target because you effectively cleared all the leakages, and if there is a 5% exclusion or inclusion error, you can leave it at that. But this 100% obsession is also one of the reasons why most of the digital solutions get into become so obtrusive and rather say, start becoming counterproductive. Otherwise, thank you for the session. It was good, nice.
Okay.
I think that's an important point, right? Like without bureaucracy, these systems don't survive successive government initiatives. When you see that there are schemes which are renamed, which are shut down when governments change, the only way something like this survives through now you have the third government, I would say, is because the bureaucrats are promoting it, and it's just because the bureaucrats believe it. And I think Ritika Khera mentioned this, right? The whole idea of single source of truth that is put up. So single source of truth, I mean, I don't know if you've read some of the investigative stories by Nitin Sethi and Kumar Sambhav Srivastava recently about ICMR, how ICMR has this single source of truth database. So single source of truth is an information model in computing where you have one database and that database alone has all the data in it. So if there are copies of this data elsewhere, and that data is different from the data that is in your central database, in case of any discrepancies, the central database data is considered authentic. It's just that there is only one source of truth. But the fact remains that in a post-truth world, what does even being truth mean? Right? Like, and this idea of this single source of truth was pushed by this one bureaucrat, J. Satyanarayana, when he built the National E-Governance Plan, which is when you saw a lot of these systems built. Aadhaar in itself was a sub part of the National E-Governance Plan. So was the National Population Register, the National Register of Vehicles, which we mentioned, whose data was used during the Delhi riots, or potentially used or misused. We don't know because nobody investigates it. So all of these systems are built because bureaucrats pushed it. And the ideas that were pushed into early 2006 of building something called the India Enterprise Architecture, the government of India is now building it. Just 2 months after the Aadhaar judgment was released, you suddenly see that this notification coming out saying we will link every other government of India database with the help of Aadhaar. Precisely the thing the Supreme Court said, linking of databases with Aadhaar is not possible because UIDAI says so, and 2 months after the judgment, they themselves start doing it. If one reads the Economic Survey of 2018-19, Chapter 4, titled Data of the People, by the People, for the People, it describes this architecture where the economic advisor actually makes a case to link all government databases and to sell this data. This is part of their design, and bureaucrats are actually promoting it. Okay, maybe we can take next questions.
I'll unmute the next person. So, Suresh Sakti Murugan, I think. Yeah.
Hello.
Yeah, he's on.
My question is to Srinivas Kothari. I have read the reports that Mukesh Ambani before one and a half year spoken in 2 occasions that we are facing a data colonization and we have to fight like a freedom's second road of freedom struggle like Mahatma Gandhi that type of thing. But now the Facebook and the WhatsApp Geo, they are investing and they are building a new model throughout our country. How these on these occasion what's happening and how the data sharing and what is the agreements are going on and what type of the model they are building up, whether you can elaborately please give the details. And my question to professor is, you have stated about that PDS, and now they have changed into the TDS, targeted distribution system, and now they are very consistently saying that the DBT model, whether it is connected with that throughout the world. Now they are saying we have throw some money to the lowest state of the people, like universal basic income, whether in the Indian policy makers and government is going on the way. Oh, that's my questions.
Do you want to talk about universal basic income before I come to it? Yeah.
Sure. Okay. So, see, this universal basic income sounds like a really good idea because I think universal systems are a good thing. But is it, first of all, do we have money for it? Yeah. If you have to do a universal transfer to everyone and even call it a basic income, you know, what is going to be the definition of a basic income? If you do anything that's a reasonable amount, then basically what you'll find is that the budget is going to be impossible. It's also not equitable, right? I mean, in a country where there's so much social and economic inequality, we have to think about this aspect as well in the case of this universal basic income. The other worry is that in the Indian context, when the debate was really going on because of this budget constraint, the idea, at least in one of the economic surveys, they were trying to say, let's just wrap up midday meals, NREGA, and a whole bunch of other social security programs and roll it all into one, give people a universal basic income. Now that is totally not on, right? Because the midday meals serve a very important purpose. They're part of children's right to food. Similarly, NREGA is also a source of sustenance to many families in rural areas. And finally, even if we had budgets to do this, would UBI, universal basic income, be the first claimant? Should it be the first claimant? I would think that healthcare is much more important. We spend in India only 1% of public expenditure of GDP is on healthcare, which is amongst the lowest in the world. Countries like France and Germany and England is like 7 to 10% of GDP. So if we do have fiscal space, then I would say healthcare should be the first priority. And this COVID pandemic has made it very obvious. Like even the best cities, Bombay, Delhi, there's just not enough hospital beds. And people need to realize that even if you care about GDP growth can come as much from more doctors, more nurses, more auxiliary nurses and midwives in rural areas, more ASHA workers, more hospital beds, more ventilators, more testing facilities. all of this is going to contribute to GDP just as much as those Rafale airplanes, which are not going to benefit any one of us and may end up killing somebody somewhere. So this spending priorities have been a big problem in the country. As far as the PDS is concerned, I think moving towards, see, Tamil Nadu, I don't know if all the participants are sitting in Tamil Nadu. That's one of the few states where you have a universal PDS because of, that whole Periyar and all the work that all these people did in the past. The whole political dynamics are very different in that state. But in the northern states, still many poor people are left out, even after the expansion of the PDS through the National Food Security Act. So these like fancy sounding tech solutions, and Mr. Kannan Gopinath was saying that for these leakage, Aadhaar, I don't know if he was actually hinting that Aadhaar had reduced leakages, but I think in some cases, Aadhaar has increased corruption because, like I said, you can use technology to obfuscate and cheat people. You can tell them biometric fail ho gaya. Actually, it has been successful. And the poor person in a village doesn't know whether the biometric authentication is successful or not. And because the dealer is a bully, he or she will just go away. And at least in fact, not only in our survey, but also one done by Karthik Muralidharan from JPAL at UCSD, we find that it has Aadhaar authentication had no impact on reducing leakages in the PDS in Jharkhand. So this technology has led to exclusion. It has increased transaction costs for poor people to get what they were getting before. And all this while, it is being seen and projected through propaganda in the public as something that has been, fantastic for the poor. And just to go back very quickly, and then I'll stop, Srinivas, sorry, that, a lot of the it's all about power. I think where power lies. Mr. Gopinath mentioned bureaucrats, So bureaucrats also see that this is the flavor of the season, and not everyone wants to take panga and speak truth to power, whether it's media or bureaucracy or wherever. So yeah, I think at the root of all this is how many people are willing to think for themselves and then to stand up and question. And the bureaucracy is certainly not structured for questioning in the North Indian states. Maybe the culture is a bit different in the southern states. Yeah.
Okay. On this idea of colonization on the rise of digital revolution, so the fourth industrial revolution, right? So cyberspace is being compared to this unoccupied space, right? It's a new land which is available for grabbing for anybody who can go out and explore. And so, which is what I was explaining in the earlier part, where you have the American big tech and the Chinese big tech, and each of them at some level are expanding to other countries. So one definitely say it's a form of colonization, and saying that India fight for its own sovereignty of developing its own computer infrastructure. I think that's very important for any nation's sovereignty. But that's not what Mukesh Ambani is proposing. Mukesh Ambani wants to go sell his software in Africa, in Southeast Asia, in Middle East. He is saying that we should. It's like the back during the first industrial revolution. You had the Spanish, you had the French, you had the Germans, and you had Britain. Each of them trying to occupy the parts of the new world, right? That's what they called all of this. It's the new world, and we're going out there to set up shops to essentially find out resources that can power their industrial revolution. And Ambani is essentially saying, look, we missed out. It's not just Ambani, it's everyone else, including the IT minister, R.S. Prasad. It's like we have missed all these industrial revolution. It's our turn to colonize the world now. And how do we do this? Because we have 1 billion people's population. We can take their data, we can experiment with their data, we can build better software solutions that the US or the American probably at a cheaper rate. All you're suggesting is, look, you don't have to buy things in dollars when you can buy things in rupees. That's what is being proposed here. And if so, if you think you're fighting in a freedom movement, maybe not. You're probably fighting in some colonial wars between different giants, but who interfund each other, right? You have the Chinese companies like Alibaba funding companies like Paytm, which are powered by UPI in India. Then you have Google Pay, which uses UPI, and at the same time you have Facebook, which is an American company, which is funding Jio. Then you have Amazon, which is now trying to buy stake in Airtel, and you have Google buying stake in Vodafone. It's I mean, it's not even some kind of colonial wars, right? There is no ideology here. Capitalism is the ideology. Everybody is in for the money. So all you're telling these companies is that you can't enter directly into India. If you want to enter, you have to invest in our own companies. That's the condition that you're putting. So I don't think there is the issue of sovereignty here. And it's like this, right? It's the whole hatred towards Chinese apps or Chinese products because you have geopolitical issues. And it's important. Technology is geopolitical because you have right now Donald Trump blocking all semiconductor products or any forms of chips and processors to China. Okay, China can't build any more systems without these essential microprocessors. And think of something like that to India, right? Like you can't have phones, you can't have laptops because US has blocked it. In an interconnected world, I don't see how the whole idea of sovereignty plays out. If we are trying to look towards an actual sovereignty, I think we need to be building some of these technologies, but we're not doing that. We're just acquiring this so that we can share it to the American or the Chinese player at a higher price. You're acquiring it at a cheaper price through state monopolies. It's like Ambani is the Jamindar who is waiting for the British Lord to come and he will hand over it in plate. Facebook being that digital overlord.
Okay, I think Professor Tarun can raise his question. He had a question, I think.
Okay, so my question is for Devdatta from the Internet Freedom Foundation. How much protection do ordinary citizens have against this? I mean, yeah, the government and the private industry are trying to benefit by, like what you say, spy on data or maybe sell it. So how good is our legal system? I mean, you have experience in this, you go and fight cases in court. So how much protection does our constitution or the legal framework have for issues like this? Are laws really strong, or how does it work?
I think, again, as Srinivas and Professor Khera have earlier mentioned, India currently does not have a general data protection law in place.
Okay.
There is a personal data protection bill which is being considered by a joint parliamentary committee, but the bill also just has glaring loopholes and these very wide exemptions which are granted to the government. So, I mean, one example of this is that, we analyze the National Population Register, which many people fear could be the base for, a subsequent National Register of Citizens. Against the PDP bill, and we tried to see if the PDP bill provides adequate safeguards to prevent something like that happening, and we found that it doesn't, because the bill just has such wide exemptions which allows the government to do whatever it wants on certain grounds, like for instance if it's necessary for the sovereignty and integrity of India, which means that the entire surveillance framework, them snooping on phone calls, reading people's emails, etc. All of that is suddenly taken out of the ambit of data protection. Another related issue is also the fact that the data protection bill does not cover forms of data which have been anonymized, because that's no longer considered personal data. And maybe Srinivas could pitch in about this a little more because he has a technical background and he'll be better able. But basically, what does anonymization mean, right? Like now, security researchers across the world have demonstrated that there are ways in which you can re-identify people if you have access to certain data points about them. So that's why, just like, removing obvious identifiers is not enough. You're now looking at things called differential privacy, which also introduce an element of randomness and noise into the data set, which prevents de-identification. So, and what kind of anonymization techniques are actually using for our projects? I mean, I can talk about Arogya Setu because that is what I have studied most closely. And Arogya Setu uses a static device identifier. This is again very different from what the Google and the Apple API uses, which is rotating keys. So obviously, if you're rotating and changing keys regularly, the chances of re-identification are lower. So I think these are two main problems that I see with the bill. One, the fact that it grants the government such wide exemptions, and two, the fact that if the government claims that some data is anonymized, suddenly no obligations apply, even though that data could by the right kind of people who have the technical expertise and know-how, be re-identified.
I actually don't believe that the Arogya Setu app anonymizes data. Okay, they do create those device IDs to exchange data across devices, but when the data is shared back to the server, you're not sure what data is in the server, and when they say they're sharing data with partners like IIT Madras itself, right? Like IIT Madras is an official partner with the Arogya Setu app, and Professor Kamakotti's lab gets access to this data. Now, we don't know what level of access they're actually giving, right? Like when they say we are doing some form of anonymization, we don't know how and what. If they're actually doing some form of anonymization, I don't see the reason why it should be selectively shared. It can be publicly shared if they're very sure about this. The fact remains that when in law, the upcoming personal data protection law clearly says the anonymization of data will be made illegal, right? It will be made an offense. So the reason that exists is because you can link multiple data sets and you can use these points to identify who an individual is. So if you have the lat longs and you don't have the user ID, but you also have, say, Google Maps or something like an UPI app, which actually collects location data when you transact with payments. All UPI apps collect GPS data. So there are these systems which can always combine these data sets, interlink them to identify who the user is. The anonymization of data is possible. Enough people have shown it. So, but even beyond that, I actually believe that MeitY, the Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology, is not anonymizing this data. Because I will not trust them until they actually prove it that they are doing it. Right now, there is not even a single paper on the algorithms that they're using for anonymization, right? So it's just like, oh, I have done this, but there is no proof of it.
Okay. So is I invite, is there any other questions from the audience? Yeah, I think actually Kannan Gopinathan was here. I actually didn't notice it was actually Kannan Gopinathan, the IAS officer who resigned against the other lockdown, which has been the very unconstitutional lockdown in Kashmir. So yeah, so he has been here. I think now he has left the meeting, but anyway, it was good that he's here. We invited him last, our last meeting was Kannan Gopinathan to talk against the effects, the ill effects and the people's movements against the NRC and PRCAA. So yeah, with that is there any more, if there's not any more questions, I think we can wind up the event. Possibly, yeah, I think if Devdatta could give a...
One more thing, just one more thing. No, just one more thing, just one thing. Kaushik, maybe you can talk to the three speakers and get a set of books or references that students could read and understand these issues at depth. You could look at that and then maybe post it online or somewhere. Yeah.
Possibly you can send it over the student broadcast mail. That's more reachable, I hope, to the campus.
Right. Yeah. So get a list from the speakers, and then you can suggest those books to others.
Can I quickly add something?
Yeah, ma'am. Go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so this was to the question that Tarun asked about the legal protections. I think he missed some of what I had said, so I'll just quickly recap. That first of all, the law that is proposed is very weak. Devdatta has already pointed that out. The penalties are very weak. Even if you violate the weak laws protections, the penalties are very weak. And I was saying earlier that because legal literacy, tech and digital literacy are so low, even if we get like a law that's even better than GDPR, then what is the hope that somebody in rural Sonbhadra is going to be able to use this law to protect himself or herself? Because the rule of law is weak and access to justice is so poor in the country.
Take the case of Aadhaar leaks itself, right? You had so many leaks. There was an Aadhaar Act which made it punishable. Nothing happened. So it will remain this way until people assert their rights. And the only idea, the hope is that once there is a law, people will file those complaints. But we still have to fight over it. It won't be handed to you in a golden plate. It never will be.
Educate, organize.
So I think there's one more question by Andy. So just I think we can wind up with that, but yeah, let's take this question also. Okay, Andy, you can unmute yourself. Yeah.
We can hear him.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for this insightful discussion. My question is to Srinivas. Now, since we've gone on the journey with the Arogya Setu app, without any sort of protection like what we have in the European states with the GDPR. Now, I'm at pains to understand the efficacy of the app on the ground. Now, we've been hearing reports of millions of downloads, but for example, I think each and every state has been doing things differently. Kerala has been using another app called Sprinkler for its contact tracing. So what's the actual, do you have any insights into the actual efficacy of the app, and has it been used in a way a contact tracing app should be used for a pandemic?
We actually don't know much. Okay, frankly, we don't know if states even get access to this data or in what format, right? Like, so there is data which you are sharing as an individual to the central government, and from the central government it goes to everyone else, and we don't know who this everyone else is. We know that IIT Madras is one party because the people who are from IIT Madras are involved as researchers, but we don't know if Kerala gets access to this data, and if it does get access to this data, in what form, what all variables are shared with Kerala, right? But you do hear about these reports at some stage where people being harassed, sometimes accidentally because they're false positives, right? Like there is some guy who goes to a hospital who gets tested COVID positive, then he gives somebody else's phone number, and incidentally this somebody else with that phone number is harassed because that phone number is what it seems Arogya Setu, which gets from ICMR, because when you go to a hospital shares data to ICMR, ICMR shares data back to Arogya Setu, and Arogya Setu team then alerts everyone else. It looks like there is no background check when someone gives their phone number at that stage, and people have been harassed at some level. While you share data from your app, you do verify it through an OTP. There are these sort of issues. So if you, in terms of the utility of the app itself, does this app function? I don't think it functions, because you know that it doesn't record when you meet your milkman who doesn't have a phone or smartphone, when you probably go for groceries, right? So like that's, as Professor Ritika was pointing out, half of the population does not have smartphones, and it will not be recorded. So even for the people whom it does record, it is only helpful when it's actually backed up, say by actual testing. You're not doing testing. I'm happy if the app is actually providing insights, asking people, saying that, look, you may have a chance to get coronavirus. Why don't you go get yourself tested? But that's not happening, right? Because we are not testing. In the entire country, we are not testing enough. India is one of those countries with the least number of testings that are being done for a highly population country, right? So it doesn't make sense. It's like so I have this saying that I always say: if the Arogya Setu app can solve the corona healthcare crisis, then I think I can do an open heart surgery with a screwdriver, right? And which is clearly the wrong tool for a problem. You probably need masks. You probably need doctors, hospitals, and all the healthcare solutions. And look, while I'm opposed to this whole idea of a mandatory app, I'm not opposed to the idea of a mandatory vaccine, provided the vaccine goes through all the standard healthcare tests before it is certified that this vaccine is what you need to get. Even in those cases of vaccination, it's a form of technology, right? It just so happened it's not information technology, it's a medical tech. And for that vaccine, before it's certified, you have health bodies which are certifying that yes, this this vaccine works. You do not see that with any form of information technology systems. It's like, who is certifying this app even works? You don't see a single epidemiologist or a healthcare worker in the list of people who have built the app. You can't have a healthcare crisis being led by technologists as a response. You need healthcare people to respond to it, and we are not seeing that. So it doesn't function to me. Even it may be giving updates or any of those analytics insights, but they're useless to me unless you're testing.
So if I could just maybe add to that a little bit, just regarding the involvement of health officials, I think we can see how other apps have done. The decision has been left in the hands of public health authorities to determine how long two phones need to be in touch with each other for that to register as contact. And often the duration of that contact is also known, so you can accurately assess what is the risk. Because, you know, if you've just been near somebody for maybe 5 seconds, the risk of you contracting COVID from them is lower than if you've been around them for, say, an entire day. Even things like distance ranges, etc., right? Like, these are things which need to be determined by public health experts and public health officials. And that's just not happening, especially because I think we call Arogya Setu a contact tracing app, but that's really a misnomer. What it really is a proximity exposure notification app with multiple other features that have been loaded onto it, including a self-assessment tool. We don't know how this self-assessment tool works at all. What is the underlying algorithm? If I tell it I have diabetes, will it then classify me as high risk? And so, yeah, I mean, these are concerns, I think, about the very fundamental efficacy of the app and their taking a healthcare intervention. So I just wanted to add that bit, yeah.
And you're witnessing that in when these people, the very people who built the Arogya Setu app, are building the national health stack, which is going to be a larger permanent infrastructure. It's not going to stop with Arogya Setu. Okay. One can probably say that it will go away post-COVID, but these systems and infrastructures once are built for a welfare system, or which was built in the name of welfare system. I don't think it was built for welfare, which was built in the name of welfare systems, was used for everything else, from SIM card linking to even for haircuts in Tamil Nadu now.
I have to go.
Okay, I think we can end it. It's almost 6:50 and no questions.